I never imagined the worst day of my life would begin with silence. Not screaming, not chaos, just the cold, suffocating silence of a hospital hallway where every passing second felt like it was stealing another piece of my soul. I sat outside the intensive care unit with my hands locked together, praying harder than I ever had in my 70 years. My son was only 42.
Healthy, disciplined.
The kind of man who never missed a morning workout and always called his mother every Sunday, no matter how busy life became. Men like him weren't supposed to die without warning. I kept telling myself the doctors would walk back through those doors with good news. But deep down, a mother's heart already knew when the doctor finally appeared, he didn't have to say a word. One look at his face, and my world collapsed. My legs gave way beneath me as every memory of my little boy came rushing back at once. The scraped knees, the first bicycle, the bedtime stories, the proud smile on the day he built his company from nothing. None of his success mattered anymore. The businessman the world admired disappeared, and all I could see was the little boy who used to believe his mama could fix anything with a hug. This time, I couldn't fix a thing. I don't know how long I sat there after the doctor walked away. Time loses all meaning when you're burying your own child. Nurses hurried past, machines continued their endless beeping, and strangers carried on with their lives while mine had just ended. Then I heard the sharp click of expensive heels echoing down the hallway. I looked up, expecting to see another grieving wife searching for comfort. Instead, I saw my daughter-in-law walking toward me looking as though she'd stepped out of a business meeting instead of a hospital. Her makeup was flawless. Her hair was perfect. There wasn't a single tear on her face.
For one foolish second, I thought she was holding herself together for my sake. I opened my arms, ready to comfort the woman my son had loved. But before I could speak, she leaned close enough that no one else could hear and quietly told me not to expect a single dollar from my son's estate. Everything belonged to her now, she said. Then, with a smile that still haunts me, she warned me to leave before security was called. My son had been gone for only minutes. And she was already talking about money. The grief inside me turned into something colder. I searched her face, hoping I'd misunderstood, hoping to find even the smallest crack in the mask she was wearing. There was nothing. No heartbreak. No disbelief. Only confidence, the confidence of someone who believed the hardest part was already over. In that moment, I realized I wasn't looking at a broken widow. I was looking at a woman who seemed strangely prepared for this day. Most people expected me to scream, argue, or collapse right there in the hallway. Instead, I did something that confused her. I looked her straight in the eyes, quietly nodded, and told her I'd see her at the funeral. Then I turned around and walked away without another word. She probably thought she'd won. What she didn't know was that old women learn something valuable with age. The loudest person in the room rarely uncovers the truth. The quiet one does. Outside, I finally allowed myself to cry. Sitting alone inside my old car, I held the small bag of my son's belongings against my chest as though it were the last piece of him I had left. His wallet, his keys, his watch, ordinary things that suddenly meant more than anything money could ever buy. But hidden among them was something that made me stop breathing. It wasn't another key to his house or office. It was an old brass key I'd never seen before, heavy with age and worn from years of use. I turned it over in my trembling hand again and again, unable to understand why my careful, organized son had been carrying something he'd never mentioned to anyone. At that moment, I believed I was holding nothing more than a forgotten key. I had no idea. I was holding the first piece of the secret that someone had already killed to protect. That brass key refused to leave my mind. I sat in the hospital parking lot long after the sun began to sink, turning it over in my hand as though it might explain itself if I stared hard enough. My son wasn't the kind of man who carried useless things. Since childhood, everything he owned had a purpose. If this old key was in his pocket on the morning he died, it wasn't there by accident. The question that kept echoing in my mind was painfully simple: what had he been trying so desperately to protect? Trying to steady my shaking hands, I went through the rest of his belongings one last time. His wallet was exactly as I'd expected, neatly arranged with family photos and a few folded bills. His watch had stopped at the moment it was removed from his wrist, and seeing it made my heart ache all over again because I'd given it to him on his 40th birthday. Then, tucked inside the pocket of the pants he'd worn that morning, my fingers brushed against a crumpled piece of paper. At first, I thought it was an old receipt, but something told me not to throw it away. Mothers learn to trust instincts that don't always make sense. I carefully unfolded it and frowned. It was a highway toll receipt. The timestamp showed my son had passed through the toll booth just a few hours before he was rushed to the hospital. But what caught my attention wasn't the time, it was the location. It wasn't anywhere near his office. In fact, it was in the opposite direction. My son never wandered without a reason. He planned every meeting, every trip, every minute of his day. So why had he secretly driven somewhere he'd never mentioned to anyone? As I stared at that tiny piece of paper, everything that had happened inside the hospital came rushing back. My daughter-in-law's perfectly calm face. The way she spoke about money before she'd even shed a tear. The strange confidence in her voice, as if she already knew exactly how everything would end. Earlier, grief had clouded my judgment. But sitting there alone, with nothing except my son's belongings and my thoughts, I could finally admit what my heart had been whispering from the beginning. Something wasn't right. Healthy men don't usually collapse without warning. Loving wives don't start talking about inheritance minutes after losing their husbands. And careful, organized sons don't secretly carry mysterious keys while driving to places they never told their mothers about. One strange detail might be a coincidence. Two might still have an explanation. But all of them together, that felt like something far darker. For the first time since the doctor broke my heart, my tears gave way to determination. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I wasn't trying to accuse anyone. I simply wanted the truth. My son deserved that much. Before I buried him, I needed to know where he'd gone that morning, and why he'd hidden it from everyone. I slipped the brass key into my handbag, folded the toll receipt beside it, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I caught myself looking once more at the hospital in my rearview mirror. I couldn't explain it, but every instinct inside me said I wasn't driving away from this nightmare. I was driving straight into it. And I had no idea, someone else was already waiting for me at the funeral. The morning of my son's funeral arrived beneath a gray sky that felt just as heavy as my heart. I barely slept the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him as a little boy chasing butterflies through our backyard, laughing so hard he could barely breathe. Then the memory would vanish, replaced by the cold hospital hallway and the doctor's heartbreaking expression. By sunrise, I'd cried all the tears I had left. What remained wasn't strength, it was a quiet determination to give my son the farewell he deserved. When I pulled into the church parking lot, something immediately felt wrong. I expected grieving family, close friends, and neighbors whose lives my son had touched. Instead, the lot was filled with luxury cars. Men in tailored suits stood in small circles discussing business between polite handshakes. Expensive watches flashed beneath the morning sun, and women carrying designer handbags exchanged careful smiles that seemed completely out of place. It looked less like a funeral, and more like a corporate event. The moment I stepped inside, the scent of fresh lilies filled the air. My eyes went straight to the front of the church where my son's casket rested beneath a sea of white flowers. For a second, everything else disappeared. The whispers, the crowd, the cameras, none of it mattered. All I could see was the place where my little boy now lay. My chest tightened so fiercely I thought I might collapse before I reached him. But before I could take another step, a young usher politely blocked my path. He apologized, glanced at the seating chart in his hands, and quietly explained that my seat wasn't in the front row. It had been assigned several rows back. I stared at him, certain there had to be some mistake. Surely a mother belonged beside her own son. The poor young man looked uncomfortable, but he simply pointed toward the fourth row and admitted he was only following instructions. I didn't argue. I quietly walked to the seat they had chosen for me. Sometimes silence tells you far more than an argument ever could. From where I sat, I had a perfect view of the woman who had pushed me there. My daughter-in-law stood beside the casket greeting every guest with flawless composure. She accepted hugs gracefully, lowered her head at exactly the right moments, and dabbed at tears that never actually fell. Anyone who didn't know her would have believed they were looking at the picture of a devastated widow. But I had seen her minutes after my son's death, and this woman wasn't the same person. Every smile felt rehearsed. Every expression looked carefully practiced. She wasn't mourning. She was performing. As the church slowly filled, I began overhearing quiet conversations drifting through the pews. But people weren't talking about my son's kindness or the countless lives he'd helped. They were discussing the company, the board of directors, investors, the future of the business. More than once, I heard someone praise my daughter-in-law for being strong enough to carry his legacy. Then another conversation froze me where I sat. Two men behind me whispered that grief had affected my memory recently and that I was becoming confused. One even admired my daughter-in-law for taking such good care of me despite everything she was going through. A chill raced through my body. Those weren't harmless rumors. Someone had already started painting me as the forgetful old mother whose words couldn't be trusted. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just about losing my son anymore. Whoever was behind this wasn't only trying to bury him. They were already trying to bury the truth with him. As the minister stepped toward the podium and the church fell silent, I folded my trembling hands and looked one last time at my son's casket. Then, without speaking a single word aloud, I made him a promise. No matter how powerful the people standing against me were, I would not let anyone rewrite my son's story. The church grew so quiet that I could hear every note from the old piano echoing through the sanctuary. The minister spoke about love, faith, and the unbearable pain of saying goodbye too soon, but I barely heard a word. My eyes never left my son's casket. I kept thinking about our last Sunday together, sitting on my porch with coffee in our hands while he promised we'd finally take that little vacation we'd been putting off for years. "Just give me a little more time, Mom," he'd said with a smile. I never imagined time was the one thing he didn't have. Then the minister invited my daughter-in-law to share a few words. She walked to the podium with slow, graceful steps, pausing just long enough to wipe away a tear that never really existed. Her voice cracked at exactly the right moments as she spoke about my son's dedication to his company, the pressure he carried, and how hard he'd worked to build his success. According to her, he'd simply pushed himself too far. It sounded believable. Heartbreaking, even. Around me, people quietly wiped their eyes, completely drawn into every carefully chosen word. But the more she spoke, the more something inside me refused to believe her. She never mentioned the man he truly was. She didn't tell them how he still called his mother every Sunday morning, no matter how busy life became. She never spoke about the struggling employee whose medical bills he'd secretly paid because he couldn't bear to watch another family suffer. She didn't tell them about the little boy who once stayed awake all night feeding an injured bird with a tiny dropper because he refused to let it die. Those were the stories that defined my son. Instead, every sentence seemed to revolve around the company, its future, and the enormous responsibility she now carried. It felt less like a farewell to a husband, and more like someone introducing herself as his replacement. That's when I noticed him. A man in a perfectly tailored navy suit sat quietly in the front row. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't crying. He wasn't even pretending to.
While the rest of the church watched the podium, his eyes remained fixed on my daughter-in-law. Then, for just a brief second, she looked directly at him. He gave the smallest nod. She answered with an almost invisible smile before continuing her speech. Most people would have missed it. I didn't. A mother spends her entire life reading faces. You learn to recognize happiness before it's spoken, fear before it's admitted, and guilt before it's confessed. Whatever passed between those two wasn't grief. It was understanding, the kind shared by people who already know exactly what comes next. From that moment on, I couldn't stop watching him. Throughout the service, he barely glanced at my son's casket. His attention never wandered far from my daughter-in-law. Every few minutes, another silent exchange passed between them before they quickly returned to their carefully practiced expressions. My heart told me they weren't strangers, and my instincts had never lied to me before. When the service finally ended, everyone stood as my son's casket was carried toward the exit. Cameras flashed. Executives surrounded my daughter-in-law, praising her strength while reporters scribbled notes. In the middle of all that attention, I became almost invisible. Oddly enough, being ignored became my greatest advantage. As the crowd slowly moved toward the reception hall, I watched my daughter-in-law quietly slip away through a side hallway. Less than 10 seconds later, the man in the navy suit disappeared after her. Neither of them looked back. Neither of them noticed the grieving old mother following at a distance. And before that afternoon was over, I was about to overhear a conversation that would change everything I believed about my son's death. I don't know what made me follow them. Maybe it was a mother's instinct. Maybe it was the strange feeling that had been growing inside me since the hospital. Whatever it was, I trusted it. Keeping my head down, slipped through the side hallway, careful not to let my footsteps echo against the polished floor. They disappeared into a quiet courtyard behind the church, hidden from the mourners, the reporters, and the cameras. It was the last place anyone would expect two grieving people to hold a private conversation. I stayed just close enough to hear their voices without being seen. The man in the navy suit looked around to make sure they were alone before speaking. "Everything went smoothly," he said in a calm, confident voice. "No one suspects a thing." My daughter-in-law let out a slow breath and answered, "What about his mother?" My heart nearly stopped.
They were talking about me.
The man gave a faint smile that sent a chill through my body. "She's grieving. Give her a few days, and she'll stop asking questions. People always do." My daughter-in-law hesitated for a moment before quietly saying something that made my blood run cold. "I'm not worried about her. I'm worried about what he might have left behind." For a second, neither of them spoke. Then the man replied with complete confidence. "We've searched the house, the office, and every place we knew about. If there was anything dangerous, we'd already have it." Searched? My mind instantly raced back to the brass key hidden among my son's belongings. They didn't know about it. Whatever they were looking for, they hadn't found everything. Before I could process another thought, my daughter-in-law lowered her voice even further. "And the safety deposit box?" she whispered. The man shook his head. "We checked every bank under his name. Nothing." I instinctively tightened my grip around my handbag. The brass keys suddenly felt much heavier. They were hunting for something, and they had no idea it was sitting only a few feet away from them. The man glanced at his watch before speaking again. "Stay calm. By next week, you'll officially control the company. Once the paperwork is finalized, this whole situation disappears." She nodded without the slightest sign of sadness. Then she smiled. Not the polite smile she'd shown the mourners inside. A real one. The kind people wear when they believe they've won. I felt sick. Only hours after my son's funeral, they weren't mourning him. They were celebrating. I carefully stepped backward, terrified one wrong move would expose me. Just as I reached the hallway, my foot brushed against a loose flower pot.
Crash.
The sound shattered the silence. Both of them turned instantly. My heart stopped. For one terrifying second, our eyes met. And I realized they knew someone had been listening. For one terrifying second, my daughter-in-law looked directly toward the hallway where I stood frozen behind the stone wall. My heart pounded so violently I was certain they could hear it. The man in the navy suit narrowed his eyes and took 2 slow steps forward. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but fear has a strange way of making your body forget how to move. I held my breath as his footsteps came closer, praying the shadows would hide me for just a few more seconds. Then someone called my daughter-in-law's name from inside the church. She turned toward the doorway and impatiently told the man they needed to get back before anyone noticed they were gone. He looked around one last time, clearly suspicious, but finally nodded and followed her inside. I waited until the sound of their footsteps disappeared before allowing myself to breathe again. My knees felt so weak I had to steady myself against the wall. They hadn't seen me, but they knew someone had been there. I quietly slipped through another hallway and rejoined the crowd as if I'd never left. Guests were gathering outside while reporters prepared their cameras for the final farewell. No one paid any attention to an old mother standing silently in the back. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the widow. They admired her strength, praised her composure, and spoke about how bravely she was handling such an unimaginable loss. If only they had heard what I'd heard. The funeral procession slowly moved toward the cemetery. I stood beside my son's grave as the casket was lowered into the earth, and with every inch it disappeared, it felt as though another piece of my heart was being buried with him. I whispered one final goodbye, placed a single white rose on top of the casket, and silently promised him something. I don't know what you were trying to protect, but I will find it. Most of the mourners left within an hour. My daughter-in-law remained surrounded by lawyers, executives, and people offering carefully rehearsed condolences. I noticed the man in the navy suit standing several yards away, speaking quietly on his phone. Every few moments, his eyes drifted toward me. He wasn't mourning. He was watching. I decided not to go straight home. Instead, I drove aimlessly through the city, giving myself time to think. My mind replayed every strange moment from the past 3 days: the mysterious brass key, the highway toll receipt, the whispered conversation behind the church, and the safety deposit box they couldn't find. One thing had become painfully clear. Whatever my son had hidden, it terrified them. Late that afternoon, I finally returned home. The little brick house looked exactly the way I'd left it, but it didn't feel the same anymore. For decades it had been my safe place, filled with birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and family dinners. Now it felt like every window was hiding a pair of unseen eyes. As I stepped onto the porch, something immediately caught my attention. An envelope had been slipped beneath my front door. There was no stamp, no return address, just 3 handwritten words. Go to the bank. My hands began to shake. I hadn't told a single person about the brass key. So who knew it existed? And how did they know I was supposed to find it? I stood there staring at the envelope for what felt like forever. My front porch had always been a place of comfort, where my son and I drank coffee on quiet Sunday mornings. Now it felt like someone had turned it into the first move of a dangerous game. I looked up and down the street. Everything appeared perfectly normal. A neighbor was watering flowers, children rode bicycles a few houses away, and an elderly couple walked their dog as if nothing in the world had changed. But after everything I discovered, I knew appearances could no longer be trusted. I picked up the envelope and carried it inside, locking every door behind me. The paper was ordinary, but the message inside wasn't. 3 simple words: go to the bank.
No signature. No explanation.
Nothing else. Whoever had left it knew about the brass key, yet they hadn't tried to steal it. Instead, they wanted me to use it. The question was why. I walked into the kitchen, emptied my handbag onto the table, and placed the brass key beside the mysterious note. The key looked even older under the bright light. On one side, almost hidden beneath years of scratches, I noticed tiny engraved numbers I'd never seen before. I grabbed my reading glasses and held the key closer. 317. Not an address. Not a date. A box number. A safety deposit box. Suddenly, the conversation I'd overheard behind the church came rushing back. We checked every bank under his name. Nothing. They had searched for it, but they hadn't found it. That could only mean one thing. The box wasn't registered in my son's name. For the first time since his death, I felt as though he was still guiding me, leaving breadcrumbs only I was meant to follow. I didn't waste another minute. I slipped the key back into my purse, grabbed my coat, and drove across town. Every stoplight felt painfully slow. Every passing car made me glance into the rearview mirror. Maybe it was only fear playing tricks on me, or maybe someone really was watching. Either way, I refused to turn back. The bank wasn't one of the large modern branches my son normally used. It was an older building tucked between a bookstore and a bakery, the kind of place that had served the same families for decades. As soon as I stepped inside, The familiar smell of polished wood and old paper filled the air. It was quiet, peaceful, too peaceful. A gray-haired banker looked up from his desk the moment I approached. Before I could explain why I was there, his expression changed. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition. He slowly stood, walked around the counter, and asked in a voice so soft only I could hear, "Mrs. Caldwell?" I nodded. He gave a slow, respectful smile. "We've been expecting you." Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had never been inside that bank before in my life. So how did they already know I was coming? For a moment, I couldn't answer. I simply stared at the elderly banker, wondering if grief had finally begun playing tricks on my mind. I'd never met this man before, yet he looked at me with the quiet familiarity of someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else," I said carefully. He shook his head. "No, Mrs. Caldwell," he replied. "Your son told me you'd say that." My heart skipped. Without another word, he motioned for me to follow him. We walked past the customer counters, through a secured hallway, and into a private office tucked away from the rest of the bank. Only after the heavy wooden door closed behind us did he finally speak again. "My name is Mr. Henderson," he said. "About 6 months ago, your son came here with very specific instructions. He rented a safety deposit box under a private trust and made one thing perfectly clear. If anything ever happened to him, this box was to remain sealed until you arrived with the key." A lump formed in my throat. "He knew I'd come?" Mr. Henderson gave a slow nod. "He said you were the only person he trusted to finish what he'd started." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My son hadn't just been planning for the future. He'd been preparing for the possibility that he might never come home. Mr. Henderson unlocked a secure cabinet and carefully placed a small black security case on the desk between us. My hands trembled as I reached into my handbag and laid the old brass key beside it. It fit the lock perfectly. With a soft click, the case opened. Inside wasn't money. There were no diamonds, no legal papers dividing an estate. Instead, I found a thick sealed envelope with my name written in my son's unmistakable handwriting. Beneath it rested a black flash drive, a folded map marked with red ink, and a stack of financial records held together by a simple paper clip. Nothing about it looked ordinary. Everything about it looked important. My fingers hovered over the envelope, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Every instinct told me that once I read whatever my son had left behind, there would be no turning back. Whatever secret he died protecting was sitting only inches away from me. Mr. Henderson remained respectfully silent, giving me the time I needed before quietly saying something that made the room feel even colder. "Your son visited this bank 3 different times." I looked up. The first time, he looked worried. The second time, he looked exhausted. Mr. Henderson paused before continuing. The third time, he looked like a man who believed he wasn't going to live much longer. A chill swept through my body. My son hadn't been caught by surprise. He'd seen the danger coming. Mr. Henderson slowly slid the envelope toward me. "Before he left, he made me promise one more thing," he said. "He told me that if you ever open this box, I was to remind you of his exact words." I held my breath. The old banker looked me straight in the eyes. "Mom, if you're reading this, it means I ran out of time." The words blurred through my tears. For several seconds, I couldn't force myself to continue reading. It felt as though my son was sitting across from me, speaking one last time. I pressed the letter against my chest, closed my eyes, and whispered the same thing I'd been saying since the hospital. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I should have protected you." When I finally unfolded the next page, his handwriting was as neat and steady as ever. "Mom, if you're holding this envelope, then I couldn't stop them. I prayed it would never come to this because you've already sacrificed enough for me. But if I'm gone, I need you to do something only you can do. Don't let anger guide you. The people behind this are counting on everyone to react with emotion instead of thinking clearly. Promise me you'll be smarter than they are." A tear rolled down my cheek. That sounded exactly like my son. Even while facing danger, he was still trying to protect me. Beneath the letter lay several pages of financial records covered in handwritten notes. At first, They looked like ordinary business documents, but the longer I studied them, the stranger they became. Millions of dollars had been quietly transferred between companies I'd never heard of. Some payments were labeled as consulting fees. Others vanished into businesses that didn't seem to exist at all. My son had circled dozens of transactions in red ink, connecting dates with arrows and writing short notes in the margins. He hadn't left random paperwork. He'd left evidence. At the bottom of the final page, one sentence was written larger than all the others. Follow the money. It always tells the truth. I slowly reached for the folded map next. It showed the northern edge of the city and several surrounding industrial areas. Most of it looked ordinary until my eyes landed on a single red circle drawn around an abandoned warehouse district. Next to it, in my son's handwriting, were 3 chilling words. Don't go alone. My stomach tightened. Why would my careful, intelligent son write a warning like that unless he'd already been there and discovered something terrifying? Then my attention shifted to the black flash drive still resting inside the case. For a split second, I almost picked it up. Almost. Then I remembered the words Mr. Henderson hadn't told me yet. The old banker cleared his throat gently. There's one last message, he said. I looked up. He made me promise I'd tell you this only after you opened the box. The room suddenly felt smaller. Mr. Henderson took a slow breath before repeating my son's exact words. Tell my mother never to plug that flash drive into her own computer. The moment she does, they'll know she has it. Every hair on my arm stood up. I stared at the tiny black device. Just moments ago, it looked harmless. Now it looked like the kind of evidence people would kill to recover. As I carefully gathered everything back into the envelope, my phone suddenly vibrated inside my purse. I almost ignored it, but when I looked at the screen, the blood drained from my face. The caller ID showed my daughter-in-law's name. I hadn't told anyone I was at the bank. So how did she know exactly where to find me? For a few seconds, I simply stared at my phone while it continued to vibrate in my hand. My daughter-in-law's name glowed across the screen, and my heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. I hadn't called anyone after leaving the cemetery. I hadn't told a single person about the brass key, the mysterious bank, or the safety deposit box sitting open in front of me. As far as anyone knew, I should have been home, grieving alone. So why was she calling now? Mr. Henderson noticed the color drain from my face, but didn't ask any questions. He quietly looked away, giving me the privacy to decide. Taking a slow breath, I answered the call, determined not to let fear creep into my voice. She greeted me with surprising warmth. I've been so worried about you, she said softly. Have you eaten anything today? I know how easy it is to forget after a loss like this. Anyone listening would have believed she was the perfect daughter-in-law, lovingly checking on her husband's grieving mother. If I hadn't overheard her behind the church, if I hadn't opened my son's safety deposit box, I might have believed every word. Instead, I let her keep talking. After a minute, her tone changed ever so slightly. Where are you right now? She asked, trying to sound casual. The question felt harmless. But after everything I'd learned, it landed like a warning. I glanced at the sealed envelope and answered as calmly as I could. I've just been driving around. I needed some time to think. A brief silence followed. Then she laughed softly. I stopped by your house earlier, she said. Your car wasn't there, so I started worrying. A cold shiver raced down my spine. She hadn't gone there to comfort me. She'd gone there to check whether I was home. I forced myself to stay calm. That's thoughtful of you, I replied. Why don't you stay with me for a few days, she continued. You shouldn't be alone. Pack a small bag and come over tonight. It'll make me feel better knowing you're safe. Months ago, I would have accepted without hesitation. Now it sounded less like kindness and more like an invitation to keep me where she could watch me. My son's words echoed through my mind. Don't trust appearances. I politely thanked her and explained that I needed a little quiet before making any decisions. For the first time since the conversation began, I heard genuine disappointment slip into her voice. It lasted only a second before she covered it with another sweet smile. Of course, she replied. Just promise you'll answer if I call again. I will. I ended the call. The silence inside the office felt heavier than before. Mr. Henderson slowly folded his hands on the desk. Mrs. Caldwell, he said carefully, your son asked me to give you one final warning if anyone suddenly became interested in where you were or what you were doing. I looked at him. He said, assume they already know more than they should. Those words settled deep inside me. Someone wasn't just watching my son's company. Was watching me. I carefully placed the letter, the financial records, the map, and the flash drive back inside the envelope before slipping everything into my handbag. Mr. Henderson walked me to the bank's front entrance, thanked me for trusting my son, and wished me luck in a tone that sounded more like a prayer. The afternoon sun hit my face as I stepped outside. Everything looked perfectly normal. Cars rolled through traffic. People crossed the street. A woman pushed a stroller past the bank without a care in the world.
Then
I noticed it. A black SUV sat half a block away with its engine running. The windows were so dark I couldn't see who was inside. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was simply someone waiting. But the moment I started walking toward my car, the SUV quietly pulled away from the curb. Not fast enough to attract attention. Just slow enough
to follow me.
I didn't drive straight home. The moment I pulled away from the bank, I glanced into my rearview mirror and saw the black SUV ease into traffic behind me. It kept its distance, never close enough to draw attention, yet never far enough to disappear. At first, I tried convincing myself I was imagining things. Grief can make ordinary moments feel threatening. But after the third turn, and the fourth, the same vehicle was still there. So I decided to test it. Instead of taking my usual route home, I turned into a neighborhood I'd never driven through before. I passed a grocery store, circled a small park, and even stopped at a red light long enough to watch the traffic behind me. The SUV stopped too. When the light turned green, so did it. By then, there was no doubt left. Someone was following me. I forced myself to stay calm. Panic was exactly what they wanted. My son had spent months staying one step ahead of these people. The least I could do was trust the lesson he'd left behind. I kept driving until I reached a busy shopping center. Instead of parking, I slowly drove through the crowded lot, pretending to search for a space. The SUV entered just seconds later. It wasn't a coincidence anymore. Whoever was inside wanted to know where I went. Not knowing what else to do, I pulled back onto the main road and headed toward home. Every few seconds, my eyes drifted to the rearview mirror. The SUV remained several cars behind, moving with quiet patience. It wasn't chasing me. It was studying me. By the time I reached my neighborhood, the vehicle suddenly disappeared. Most people would have felt relieved. I didn't. People who know they're being watched don't disappear by accident. They disappear on purpose. I circled the block twice before pulling into my driveway. My little brick house looked exactly the way it always had, but it no longer felt like the safest place in the world. As I stepped out of the car, I scanned every window, every parked vehicle, every quiet corner of the street. Nothing seemed unusual. Sometimes, that's the most dangerous sign of all. The moment I walked inside, I locked every door and closed every curtain. Then I carried everything from the bank into the kitchen and spread it across the table. The letter, the financial records, the map, the flash drive. Each piece answered one question and created three more. My eyes settled on the flash drive. It sat there silently, daring me to ignore my son's warning. Every instinct wanted to know what was inside. But I trusted my son more than my curiosity. If he believed plugging it into my computer could expose me, I wasn't about to make that mistake. Instead, I unfolded the map again. This time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Near the red circle around the abandoned warehouse, almost hidden beneath one of the folds, was a tiny handwritten note. Don't go alone. Only 4 words. But they told me everything. My son hadn't circled that place because it was important. He'd circled it because it was dangerous. Before I could think any further, a car door slammed outside. I froze. Then another. Slow, deliberate footsteps moved across my front walkway. They stopped right outside my front door. For a moment, I couldn't move. The footsteps stopped just outside my front door. Then, 3 soft knocks. Not loud. Not impatient. Almost polite. The kind of knock that somehow feels even more unsettling than someone pounding on the door. I quietly gathered everything from the kitchen table. The flash drive disappeared into the inside pocket of my handbag. The map, the financial records, and my son's letter followed. Years of raising a family had taught me one thing: panic wastes time. Calm keeps you alive.
The doorbell rang. Once.
Then again. Whoever stood outside wasn't leaving. Keeping myself out of sight, I slipped toward the living room and carefully pulled back the corner of the curtain just enough to see the porch. A young delivery driver stood there holding a medium-sized cardboard box. I let out the breath I'd been holding. Maybe I was letting fear control my imagination. I opened the door only a few inches. "Can I help you?" The young man smiled politely. "Package for Mrs. Caldwell." I wasn't expecting anything. He glanced at the shipping label. "It was sent overnight this morning." That made no sense. Who would send me a package on the very day of my son's funeral? I signed for it, thanked him, and watched until his delivery van disappeared around the corner before locking the door again. The box wasn't heavy. In fact, it felt almost empty. There was no return address. Only my name. I carried it to the kitchen, grabbed a small knife, and carefully sliced through the tape. Inside wasn't a gift. There wasn't any packing paper.
Either.
Only a single black velvet box. My hands began trembling as I slowly lifted the lid. Inside rested my son's expensive wristwatch. I stared at it in disbelief. It was the very same watch the hospital had returned to me after his death. The same watch I'd placed inside my bedroom dresser before leaving for the funeral that morning. My heart stopped. I slowly turned toward the hallway. The watch should still be upstairs. Barely breathing, I rushed into my bedroom and pulled open the top drawer. The small cloth pouch from the hospital was exactly where I'd left it. I emptied everything onto the bed. His wallet, his wedding ring, his keys. But the watch was gone. I searched the drawer again. Then the pouch. Then every inch of the dresser. Nothing. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. Someone had entered my house while I was gone. Not to steal money. Not to rob me. They had taken one single item and mailed it back to me. Not because they wanted to return it. Because they wanted me to know they could walk into my home whenever they pleased. That wasn't theft. It was a warning. Trying to steady my breathing, I picked up the watch again. At first glance, everything looked normal. Then something caught my eye. The back cover wasn't sitting perfectly flat. There was the tiniest gap along one edge. My son took exceptional care of everything he owned. His watch had always been flawless. This wasn't. I grabbed the small magnifying glass I used for reading and examined it closely. Tiny, fresh scratch marks surrounded the edge of the case. Someone had opened it recently. Very carefully, I pressed my fingernail against the loose edge.
Click.
The back cover popped open. I wasn't looking at gears or batteries. Hidden inside was a tiny folded piece of paper. And somehow, I already knew it was from my son. For a long moment, I simply stared at the tiny memory card resting inside my son's watch. It was so small that anyone opening the watch in a hurry could have.
To activate an account that had been completely silent since the day my son died. Dexter looked at us with a seriousness I'd never seen before. "They know someone is following his trail," he whispered. "And they're making their next move." At that moment, I realized the hunt for my son's secret had just become a race. The drive to the old service station felt longer than it really was. No one in the truck spoke. Samuel kept his eyes fixed on the road, while Dexter quietly studied the map spread across his lap, comparing every note my son had left behind. I sat in the back, holding my handbag against my chest, replaying my son's final morning over and over. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that he had known he was being followed. He hadn't been driving toward the warehouse in panic. He'd been buying himself time, making one final move before meeting the people who wanted him dead. Nearly an hour later, we pulled into a small roadside service station that looked untouched by time. The faded fuel pumps, the cracked parking lot, and the tiny convenience store were exactly the kind of place most people would drive past without a second glance. Yet to my son, it had been familiar. Safe. A place where no one would question him if he stopped for a few minutes. An elderly man stepped out from the garage, wiping grease from his hands with an old towel. The moment he saw me, his expression changed. He stared for a few seconds before quietly saying my son's name. I felt my heart tighten as I nodded. Without asking a single question, he removed his cap and lowered his head. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said softly. He was a good man. His voice carried genuine sadness, not the empty sympathy I'd heard so many times since the funeral. I asked if he remembered seeing my son a few days before he died. The old mechanic didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the empty parking lot as though making sure no one else was listening. Only then did he admit that my son had stopped there early that morning. He hadn't filled the car with fuel. He hadn't bought coffee. In fact, he'd seemed distracted, constantly checking his mirrors as though expecting someone to arrive. My pulse quickened. "What did he do?" I asked. The mechanic thought for a moment before pointing toward an old soda vending machine standing beside the building. It hadn't worked in years and had become little more than decoration. He explained that my son had walked over to it, knelt beside it for less than a minute, then returned to his car. Before leaving, he'd smiled and said, "If anyone ever asks about today, tell them I only stopped for directions." At the time, the mechanic thought it was an odd joke. Now, it sounded like a carefully planned instruction. Samuel and Dexter hurried toward the rusted vending machine, while I followed close behind. From the front, it looked completely ordinary, but when Samuel carefully pushed against one side, it shifted several inches. Hidden behind it was a small metal access panel built into the wall. It was old, dusty, and almost invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. My heart pounded as Samuel slowly opened the panel. Inside, there was a small waterproof container. No one spoke. With trembling hands, I lifted it out and carefully removed the lid. Inside wasn't cash. It wasn't jewelry. It was another sealed envelope in my son's handwriting. And beneath it rested a small external hard drive wrapped in protective plastic. Dexter stared at it in disbelief. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "We found it." Before anyone could celebrate, the sound of tires screeching across the gravel shattered the silence. 3 black SUVs raced into the service station parking lot. They weren't looking for fuel. They were looking for us. The moment the black SUVs came to a stop, every instinct inside me screamed to run. Their doors flew open almost simultaneously, and several men stepped out, moving with the confidence of people who knew exactly what they had come for. They weren't shouting. They weren't waving weapons. Somehow, that made them even more frightening. Calm people are usually the ones with a plan. Samuel reacted first. Without hesitation, he grabbed the waterproof container from my hands and slipped it back into my handbag. Then he looked me straight in the eyes and quietly said something I'll never forget. "Whatever happens next, don't let them separate you from that bag. If they take it, your son dies a second time." Those words hit me harder than anything else I'd heard since the funeral. I tightened my grip on the bag and nodded. The tall man leading the group walked toward us with an almost friendly smile. He was dressed in an expensive suit. His shoes were spotless despite the gravel beneath his feet, and his voice was surprisingly polite. If I'd met him anywhere else, I might have mistaken him for a successful businessman. "I'm afraid you've picked up some thing that doesn't belong to you," he said calmly. No one answered. He glanced at the handbag hanging from my shoulder before looking back at me. "Mrs. Caldwell," he continued, "your son made a terrible mistake. There's no reason for you to make the same one." For just a second, fear tempted me to hand everything over. Then I remembered my son's handwriting. "Follow the money. Don't trust appearances." Run to Dexter. Every clue had brought me here. I wasn't about to throw it away. Samuel quietly stepped in front of me while Dexter casually reached into his coat pocket. The man in the suit noticed the movement immediately and smiled. "I wouldn't do that," he said. "My people are nervous today." Only then did I notice the others spreading out around the parking lot, slowly closing every possible exit. They weren't rushing us. They didn't need to. They believed we'd already lost. The elderly mechanic suddenly walked out from his garage carrying nothing more than a rusty wrench. His hands were shaking, but he still placed himself beside us. He looked at the suited man and said, in the calm voice of someone who had spent his whole life doing the right thing, "Leave these people alone. They've done nothing wrong." The man sighed. "I was hoping you wouldn't get involved." Before anyone could react, another black SUV pulled into the station. This one wasn't with the others. It stopped between us and the men surrounding us. The driver's door opened. A young woman stepped out. It was the same frightened woman who had called me. She hurried toward us, her face pale with fear, clutching a laptop against her chest as though it were the most valuable thing in the world. "They copied everything," she gasped. "Before your son died, he made me duplicate every file." The suited man's smile disappeared for the first time. His eyes locked onto the laptop. Not the handbag. The laptop. In that instant, I understood something that changed everything. The hard drive hidden behind the vending machine wasn't the only evidence my son had protected. The laptop the young woman carried contained the missing half of the truth. And now, everyone was willing to risk everything to get it. For a split second, no one moved. Every pair of eyes shifted from my handbag to the laptop, clutched tightly against the young woman's chest. The suited man's calm expression vanished, replaced by something far more dangerous. Desperation. He hadn't come to the service station for the hard drive alone. He'd come because he believed everything my son had uncovered could finally be destroyed in one place. The young woman struggled to catch her breath before stepping closer to us. Tears filled her eyes as she apologized for not coming sooner. Fear had kept her hiding ever since my son's death. She'd watched strangers sitting outside her apartment, received anonymous calls in the middle of the night, and even changed hotels 3 times in 1 week because she was convinced someone was following her. She admitted she'd almost destroyed the laptop herself more than once. But every time she considered it, she remembered my son's final words. "If anything happens to me, promise you'll get this to my mother." Hearing that nearly broke me. Even in the middle of the biggest fight of his life, he'd still believed I would finish it. The suited man slowly stepped forward and offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He claimed none of us understood what we were involved in. According to him, those files would ruin innocent businesses, destroy thousands of jobs, and create chaos far beyond our imagination. He insisted my son had misunderstood what he'd discovered and had been manipulated by people with their own agenda. For just a moment, his words sounded convincing. Then Dexter quietly laughed. It wasn't the laugh of someone amused. It was the laugh of someone who'd heard the same lie too many times. He calmly explained that powerful people always hide behind the same excuse. Whenever the truth is about to come out, they claim exposing corruption will hurt innocent people. They don't protect the public. They protect themselves. The only difference this time was that my son had documented everything so carefully that no amount of excuses could erase the facts. The suited man's smile disappeared. He knew the conversation was over. Without warning, one of the men behind him lunged toward the young woman, trying to snatch the laptop from her hands. Everything happened at once. Samuel shoved me behind the old vending machine. The mechanic swung his rusty wrench, forcing one attacker to stumble backward. The young woman held onto the laptop with everything she had, refusing to let go even after she was knocked to the ground. And Dexter, instead of running, pulled a small satellite phone from his coat pocket and pressed a single button. The suited man's eyes widened. "You called them?" he shouted. Dexter smiled for the first time. "No," he replied quietly. My son did. For a second, I didn't understand. Then Dexter looked at me and explained what my son had arranged months earlier. If anyone ever tried to access certain hidden files without entering a secret verification code, an automatic emergency message would be sent to multiple investigative agencies, independent journalists, and international financial crime units, all at the same time. My son had planned for this day. He knew that if they ever came looking for the evidence, they would expose themselves in the distance. The faint sound of approaching sirens began to echo across the highway. The suited man heard them too. For the first time since this nightmare began, he looked afraid. The distant sirens grew louder with every passing second. At first, they were nothing more than a faint echo rolling across the highway. Then the sound became impossible to ignore. Every person standing in that service station parking lot heard it, and every person reacted differently. The suited man looked over his shoulder. For the first time since I'd met him, his confidence disappeared. He wasn't thinking about escaping with the evidence anymore. He was thinking about escaping. Several of the men behind him began backing toward the black SUVs, waiting for orders. Panic had replaced the calm discipline they'd shown only moments earlier. They had expected frightened witnesses. They hadn't expected my son to plan for this long, after his own death. Dexter quietly walked over to the young woman and helped her to her feet. She was bruised and shaken, but she still refused to let go of the laptop. I looked at that young woman and realized she'd carried my son's final promise through weeks of fear, knowing every day could have been her last. She hadn't run because she was brave. She'd stayed because she believed the truth mattered more than her own safety. The suited man made one final attempt. He looked directly at me and spoke in a calm voice, almost pleading now. He said none of this had to happen. If I handed over the handbag and the laptop, everyone could walk away. No more funerals, no more fear, no more lives ruined. Months earlier, I might have believed him. But grief has a strange way of sharpening the truth. I looked him straight in the eyes and quietly told him something my son once said to me when he was only a little boy. The truth doesn't disappear just because someone is afraid of it. For a brief moment, no one moved. Then the first police vehicles appeared at the end of the road. The suited man glanced toward the flashing lights before turning back to us. His expression became cold again, as though he'd already accepted that his plan had failed. He gave a slight nod to one of his men. The man reached into his jacket. My heart stopped. But instead of pulling out a weapon, he pulled out a car key. Within seconds, every member of the group sprinted toward the waiting SUVs. Tires screamed against the pavement as the vehicles sped away, throwing gravel into the air and disappearing onto the highway, just moments before the police reached the service station. The officers rushed toward us, asking questions from every direction. They wanted to know who the men were, why they'd attacked us, and what they were searching for. I remembered the warning I'd received days earlier. Never trust the police. So I said almost nothing. I simply handed the lead investigator one of the fake financial records instead of the real evidence. It was enough to begin an investigation, but not enough to destroy everything if the wrong person was standing in uniform. Dexter noticed exactly what I'd done. As the officers secured the area, he quietly leaned toward me and smiled. "Your son would have been proud," he whispered. Later that evening, after giving only the information we knew was safe, we returned to the bookstore. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, we placed everything together on one table. The hard drive from the service station, the hidden memory card from the watch, the flash drive from the bank, the laptop the young woman had protected, the financial records, the notebook, the letters. Every piece of my son's puzzle was finally in one place. Dexter connected the devices to a secure computer that wasn't linked to the internet. None of us spoke while the files slowly loaded onto the screen. Folder after folder appeared. Bank records, Secret recordings, emails, contracts, photographs, video files. Everything my son had spent months collecting. Then, one folder appeared that none of us had seen before. Its title contained only 4 words. Open this together. My hands began to tremble. Somehow, I knew the biggest secret of all was waiting inside. For a few moments, none of us touched the keyboard. The room was so quiet that I could hear the ticking of an old clock hanging above the bookstore shelves. After everything we'd been through, it felt impossible that the final answers were sitting only 1 click away. My son had spent months protecting these files, dividing them into separate hiding places, risking everything to make sure the truth survived, even if he didn't. Now, every piece of his puzzle had finally come together. Dexter slowly opened the folder labeled, "Open this together." There was only one video file. He pressed play. My son's face appeared on the screen. He looked tired. There were dark circles beneath his eyes, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in them. But when he smiled, I saw the same little boy who used to run into my arms after school. "Mom," he began softly, "if you're watching this, then things didn't happen the way I hoped. I wanted to be sitting beside you when all of this was over. I wanted to tell you that everything was okay. But if you're here instead, it means I ran out of time." Tears streamed down my face. He took a slow breath before continuing. "First, I need you to know something. None of this was your fault. You gave me everything a son could ever ask for. You taught me to tell the truth, even when it was difficult. If I chose this fight, it's because you raised me to believe that doing the right thing is always worth the cost." I covered my mouth, trying to stop myself from crying. My son smiled again. "I know you're probably surrounded by people trying to tell you what to do. Don't listen to fear. Listen to facts. Everything you need is inside these files. Every payment, every fake company, every secret meeting, every recording. It's all there. If you're watching this with Samuel and Dexter, then you made it farther than I ever thought possible." Samuel quietly lowered his head. Dexter wiped his glasses without saying a word. Then my son said something none of us expected. "There's one more thing you need to know. I wasn't trying to save my company. I was trying to save thousands of families. The money they stole wasn't just numbers on a screen. It was people's retirement savings, college funds, medical charities, and small businesses. Every dollar they took changed someone's life. That's why I couldn't walk away." Suddenly, this was never about revenge. It was about justice. The video continued. "If you've reached this point, don't hide the truth anymore. Release everything. Every file, every recording, every document. Let the world decide what happens next. Secrets protect criminals. Truth protects innocent people." He paused for several seconds before smiling one last time. "Mom, don't spend the rest of your life chasing the people who took mine. Spend it living the life you always wanted. That's how you win. That's how they lose." The screen faded to black. No one in the room spoke. There was nothing left to say. Everything my son had fought for, everything he'd sacrificed, had led to this moment. Over the following weeks, Dexter and several trusted investigative journalists carefully verified every document before releasing the evidence to authorities and major news organizations around the world. The files triggered one of the largest financial crime investigations in the country's history. Executives resigned. Hidden bank accounts were frozen. Arrest warrants were issued. Companies built on fraud collapsed almost overnight. The people who believed money could bury the truth finally discovered something far more powerful. The truth had outlived them. Months later, I stood beside my son's grave with fresh flowers in my hands. This time, I wasn't there to ask questions. I already knew every answer that mattered. I gently placed my hand on the headstone and smiled through my tears. You did it, sweetheart, I whispered. You kept your promise. As I turned to leave, the morning sunlight broke through the clouds. For the first time since losing my son, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like peace.